All right, so we're gonna finish up by adding in some more detail for the female reproductive tract, and then a little bit of just overall kind of things about human sexual response. And then we will, what do they say? Strike the set and call it a wrap. So let's do it. All right, so for the woman, obviously, in addition to just having gonads making the gametes, we have all of the uterus and fallopian tubes and stuff involved that are going to be there for kind of the development of the fetus. So let's look at the basic anatomy. In fact, actually probably makes sense to look at the anatomy. It'll be faster if I just share the PowerPoint stuff. And actually this is, yeah, kind of cool. This, I started with this one. It was talking about the homologies. You know, this is like at a month and a half, whether it's going to be a baby boy or baby girl, or it looks exactly the same. And then like a few months in, you know, what's going to become the clitoris or the penis start changing. Those, again, the labioscrotal swellings are going to be the labia majora in the woman, but the testes are going to descend through the inguinal canal and fill them out and stretch them out, and will become the scrotal sac in the dude. The urethral fold is a thing. It becomes a labia minora in the woman, but it folds around the urethra to becomes the shaft of the penis in the guy. It doesn't always work. There's a lot of boys, little baby boys, that are born with what's called hypospadia, which is a hole at the bottom of their penis where urine leaks out when they try to pee. So it's not that uncommon to have that just surgically fixed when you're like, you know, born or baby. So let's look at the adult. Oh, I should also, while we're here, it's worth adding this in as a final kind of clinical thing. This is the guy still, obviously, you know, penis. Here is the vas deferens coming up, mixing with the seminal vesicle secretions, mixing with the prostate gland secretions to make the semen. Again, notice that the prostate gland, I was mentioning it with words, but it's more obvious here. It's like a walnut with a tunnel through it that the urethra goes through here. So it's really common as guys get older for the prostate gland to overgrow. What's going to be a symptom of having a enlarged prostate?
Difficulty peeing.
Difficulty peeing. It's going to squeeze off the urethra. So this idea of benign prostatic hyperplasia, which just means enlarged prostate but not cancerous, is going to make it harder to pee. It's also a common site of actual cancer, like prostate cancer. The proximity to the rectum, this is the rectum, this is the large intestine, the rectum. It's actually a very common digital rectal exam. Someone will put on a rubber glove and stick their finger up the anus into the rectum, and you can actually palpate to see the condition of the prostate there. So just in case you're going on the more clinical side of things. Okay, let me continue. In the female, you have the ovaries, which are the gonads, obviously. Which are kind of up in here, and they don't descend in down out of the body like the testes do. But obviously there's a lot more going on. There's the uterus. The uterus, which is, you know, more commonly known as the womb. You know, in order for a pregnancy to proceed normally, the developing embryo has to implant in the wall of the uterus, and it's going to end up stretching way out. It starts, yeah, we'll talk more about that. The fallopian tube, also called oviduct or uterine tubule, is how the eggs that are released from the ovary are going to make it up and get into here. You know, when an egg gets ovulated at the ovary, it's only viable for 12 to 24 hours. So if a woman's going to get pregnant, then either she has to, if there's no sperm around when she ovulates, she's got to have the sperm coming in the next day, because the egg is only going to stay viable for a day. Or it could be sperm that are already hanging around. Like I said, it could be from sex having 4 or 5 days ago, and the sperm are already just swimming around and like biding their time. And it's like, oh my God, ovulation, the egg showed up and now they can get there. So there's that kind of like, you know, around five plus or minus a day window. If the egg does get fertilized, it takes about a week to make the journey through the fallopian tubes down to the uterus where it's going to implant. Like I said, that's why the egg has to be so big and have so much stuff in it and resources. And in fact, the only thing you get from your dad is genes. Everything else, like all of your mitochondria and other cellular organelles, are all descended from your mom. Matrilineal lineage can be determined by looking at mitochondrial DNA, because it has nothing to do with the guys that were involved in reproduction. Other things about the fallopian tube, it's actually kind of cool. It's not actually attached as a kind of closed tube. Like if you're a sperm, you get created in the seminiferous tubules, and you end up in the epididymis, and you end up in the vas deferens, and you end up in the urethra, and you end up at the tip of the penis, and that was it. There was no chance to ever get out of the system. With the female side, it's actually, there's a chance of something going wrong. So normally you have these little fingers, they're called fimbriae. You can see them here. The little fimbriae kind of sweep the egg up and bring it along where it needs to be. But it's possible that the egg gets ovulated and it just implants in the kind of serous membranes of your abdominal cavity, and starts growing. And as it starts growing, it can actually start ripping apart stuff and stuff. The term for an egg that is a fertilized egg, an embryo that's starting to grow someplace where it shouldn't, if it's not in the wall, appropriate place in the uterus, we say it's an ectopic pregnancy. Which can be really dangerous, because as this thing starts growing really fast, it can just rip stuff apart. Ectopic pregnancy can be if the egg implants and starts growing in the uterine tubule, in the fallopian tube as well, or it can actually be outside of the system altogether. When a woman of reproductive age comes in with abdominal pain, they always give her a pregnancy test to rule out ectopic pregnancy as what's going wrong. So we'll talk a bit more about that. The vagina is basically the little canal that leads out to the vaginal opening, kind of the female reproductive, or is for the female copulatory organ, as they say. Vagina actually comes from the word for sheath, like invaginate, because it ensheaths the male penis. It's one of the things that's interesting, like we'll talk about a little more. Like in the guy, you have the penis kind of does everything. It's for urinating, getting rid of urine. It's sexual pleasure, all the nerve endings in the head of the penis. It's the copulatory organ. It's the way of connecting up the plumbing with the woman to get the sperm and the egg together. In a woman, you have those separated. There's the vagina, and the vaginal canal is the copulatory organ for getting the sperm and the eggs together. There's going to be the clitoris, which is its own structure that has all those sensory nerve endings for sexual pleasure. And then the urethral opening is its other own structure when we get to the vulva. So they're kind of three separate things versus in a guy, they're all rolled up into this penis thing. So this is the basic layout here. Let me see what other things I want to say while we're here. Oh, right to clear. So this is also, it's worth looking at this real briefly. This is kind of a side view. Again, here is the vagin. Here's the urethral opening, so you can see it's separate. Here's a vaginal canal leading up into the uterus. This uterus here, this is kind of typical to have it folded forward like this. It's called an antiverted uterus. Some women have retroverted uteruses where they're folded back. You can even have prolapsed uterus if especially after birth and the muscles of the floor of the pelvis get weakened. The cervix, which is basically the neck of the uterus, can actually poke out the vaginal opening. I was talking about kind of that vasocongestion in a woman during sexual arousal. During sexual arousal, the uterus actually does fold back more, kind of elongates and stretches out the vaginal canal. Again, it's just harder to see. As well as here's the clitoris. The clitoris will have spongy tissue just like the penis. The clitoris will be engorging with blood and becoming enlarged and more sensitive during that vasocongestion of sexual arousal. Again, it's just more tricky to see. So let's talk a little bit more about the uterus. It's got a lot of just muscle, smooth muscle, so it can squeeze and stuff. But then the lining is what we care about. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus. There are two parts to it. There's the part that is kind of constant. But then there is a layer that regrows at the beginning of each month and sloughs off as a menstrual flow at the end of the month. And that is called the functional layer. And so let's take a look at that. So this functional layer has all these little glands. These are called uterine glands for making these kind of nutritious glycoproteins and stuff that can help nourish the little developing embryo and stuff. So when we look at the cycle that's going on in the woman, We're going to be looking at what's going on in the ovary with the development of the follicle, the egg, and the associated cells. We're going to go also what's going on in the uterus during this month-long cycle, which is going to involve the growing of the functional layer. It's being mature, ready to have a little embryo in bed and start growing if that happened. And if there is no pregnancy, then this all gets sloughed off. The little vessels that are supplying it pinch off, and all of these cells and blood come out as the menstrual flow. So we'll see that locked in. And again, kind of the growth of this lining is going to be, due to estrogen. Menses, but then kind of staying intact is going to be progesterone. And then when progesterone drops off, that's when we're going to have menses starting. So we'll put this all together. So we're going to have to remember the uterus. And again, the fallopian tubes are kind of coming in there. Let's look at the ovary. So again, I've mentioned this, but I'll look at it in a little more detail now. Again, when you're born, you have a few 100,000 what are called primordial follicles. So it's basically a primary oocyte. It's an oocyte that has committed into meiosis. And then these associated cells that are then on there as well, which in this case we call follicular cells. So you have you have about 400,000 of these things when you're born. But they're all committed into meiosis, but then kind of go to sleep. In response to FSH, again, once a woman has hit sexual maturity, if FSH is coming in, and we'll talk more about the big picture with FSH and GnRH and all of that, but FSH is going to come in, and not all, but nobody even knows why some or another don't, but some of these start developing. And you start going from a primordial follicle to what's called a primary follicle, where these cells start becoming more, now they're called granulosa cells. Right? This is still the ovum inside. And we become a secondary follicle as we start getting these fluid spaces in between. Until only one is going to make it all the way, typically. And obviously you have fraternal twins, you can get two. But ultimately you end up with what's called the Graafian follicle, which is big, which is like the size of your thumb or something. It's actually like a big blister on the side of the ovary. The egg is further along meiosis, although still not quite all the way done. It's still got these granulosa cells. Even when it's ovulated, it's going to have granulosa cells, which are now called the corona radiata. Remember, I talked about that's why you need the acrosome, because even once the egg is spit out into the system, it's still got a wall of cells around that the sperm need to digest through to get to the egg. There's this fluid-filled antrum area. This takes about 2 weeks from where you start with a primordial follicle to you have this mature egg on the verge of ovulating. There's these granulosa cells. There are also, let's make it green. There are other cells called fecal cells that are worth putting in here that are derived from the connective tissue in here. And this thing is making estrogen. So the fecal cells actually make testosterone, but then the granulosa cells convert it into estrogen. Right, so the fecal cells are kind of like the interstitial cells in the testes. And in fact, even in a human, in a male, testosterone often is the active thing is this dihydrotestosterone, which when testosterone gets converted by another enzyme in the guy called 5-alpha reductase. But in a woman, you have the fecal cells making testosterone, but ultimately the granulosa cells convert it into estrogen. And the estrogen is going to stimulate the endometrial regrowth. We're going to put this all together in a little bit, but I'm kind of showing you like the ovary on its own right now. What is going to trigger ovulation?
It's a big spike in, is it luteinizing hormone?
Yeah, exactly. There's going to be a spike in luteinizing hormone. And that is going to lead to ovulation. It's kind of magical. Nobody's quite sure exactly how it happens, but it happens. It's usually about 2 weeks in. So what happens then is the egg gets sent out. With its little corona radiata, the little thing of cells, to its destiny. Maybe it's going to meet a sperm and get fertilized, or maybe not. We'll talk about those two conditions in a few moments. After the egg gets ovulated, the rest of this structure reconfigures and becomes the corpus luteum, which is making progesterone. And like I said, progesterone is going to help maintain the uterine lining. So maintains endometrium. But assuming no pregnancy, the corpus luteum degenerates after about a week and a half. Now, like, how many, what is that in? I'll just say a week and a half. So now we have all the parts and pieces that we need to describe the whole cycle in a woman. We've got the ovary, these first 2 weeks where under the influence of FSH, an egg is developing into this mature form. At 2 weeks in, the spike of luteinizing hormone causes ovulation. The leftover cells become this corpus luteum. Over the next 2 weeks, they're making progesterone, which maintains the uterine lining in preparation for some pregnancy. But after about a week and a half, this is actually starting to degenerate. And you can guess what's going to happen as this degenerates and the progesterone goes away. That is going to be the impetus for the menstrual flow to start. The whole endometrium is going to become unattached from the basal layer and slough off. All the cells and blood leave the vaginal opening as the menstrual flow. So here we go. Let's put it all together. So we need to think about the hypothalamus, because that's where it's all going to start. Because gonadotropin releasing hormone is ultimately the thing that's pulling the strings on the gonadotropins. And we're going to have to think about the pituitary, because the gonadotropins are the things that we just talked about pulling the strings on the ovary. Then we're going to have to think about the ovary, what's going on in the ovary. And then we have to think about the uterus, what's going on in the uterus with the endometrium. So we're going to look at all 4 of these and see how they interlock with each other right now. Let's start like at day 0. Yep. The cycle can be slightly different for different women, but it's typically around 28 days for the whole thing. So it's all going to start because gonadotropin releasing hormone is starting to rise in the body. Let me spell it right. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is starting to go up. When gonadotropin releasing hormone is starting to go up, what's going to happen to FSH from the pituitary?
It's going to be released.
Right? Remember the whole point, gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of the gonadotropins. So FSH starts going up. When FSH starts going up, what's going to happen in the ovary?
Luteinizing hormone and oh wait, no, sorry. Estrogen will be made.
Right, or the egg starts developing.
Okay.
Right, so we're gonna start having the egg developing. So right, so we're gonna have this kind of follicular phase going on here. And that follicle is going to make estrogen. The estrogen is going to do 2 things. One is the estrogen actually suppresses gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is suppressed by estrogen as well as progesterone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to come down as the estrogen's going up. The estrogen is also going to cause the uterine lining to regrow. So we're going to have, so the endometrium regrows. What we call the proliferative phase of the uterus. Meanwhile, the egg is also, kind of developing. And then at day 14, this is where we're going to have, for whatever reason, let me do it another, maybe green. We have that crazy spike of luteinizing hormone. And that's going to cause ovulation. Right? Does that make sense? Once ovulation happens, what happens in the ovary? So remember we started in this follicular phase where the follicle is developing. What's happening to the follicle after luteinizing hormone and ovulation happened?
It turns into the corpus luteum and starts pumping out progesterone.
Yeah, luteal phase. Makes progesterone. The progesterone is going to continue to inhibit the gonadotropin releasing hormone, still keep it low. Right, so this is keeping us from only starting the cycle once and not continuing having more eggs developing, right? Because as soon as gonadotropin releasing hormone is down, the FSH is coming down. So we're not having more eggs developing with more FSH. So the gonadotropin releasing hormone is suppressed for this whole cycle. So we're not going to be making more eggs and things. That progesterone is going to be maintaining the uterine lining. Maintains endometrium. Sometimes they call this the secretory phase because the little glands are secreting yummy things for the little developing embryo. At the end of the luteal phase, that's when I was saying the corpus luteum degenerates. So progesterone is going down. What is going to happen to the endometrium as progesterone goes down?
Gonna slough off.
It's going to slough off. So it's at the end here. This is going to, so here's where we're going to get the menstrual phase. The first few days, like when you are having your period, that's actually the beginning of the next cycle already. Like day 0 through 3 or 4 is actually when you're bleeding. That's when actually the newest egg is actually starting its journey to become a mature egg already. So the menstrual flow is actually not the end, it's actually the beginning of the next phase.
What is that last phase called?
The secretory phase.
After the corpus luteum degenerates, there's not a phase?
No, it's just the end of the luteal phase.
Okay.
Right, and so at this point, there's no more progesterone and no more estrogen. So what's going to happen to gonadotropin releasing hormone?
Gonna do it again, right?
It's going to come back up, right? It's no longer being suppressed by either estrogen or by progesterone. So it comes back up and we start all over again, right? So that's the classic cycle. You know exactly how many days it takes for the egg. It might be plus or minus a few days. Each woman might have her cycle being a few days more or less than this, but it's typically about this. So you should understand this. There's pictures in your book. You know, it does make sense once you actually think about it and put it all together. But you know, on your exam next week, you know, I will expect you to understand how the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the ovary, and the uterus all kind of lock together to make this happen.
So luteinizing hormone really just plays a role right there in the middle to stimulate ovulation. And I think you said it seems kind of like the outlier here, in that it's not, as far as we know, totally affected or regulated by other hormone levels.
Right. It's more got this weird thing where it's suppressed with the FSH until the midpoint, in which case it like has this crazy spike. So you have to kind of, it's the exception that proves the rule, whatever that means. Yeah, it's the one thing that is not intuitive. You just have to know that luteinizing hormone will spike at 14 days and cause ovulation. Women, like a lot of women, I've talked to women who can feel like there's like a twinge, like which ovary ovulates usually alternates from month to month. And there's this, like they call Mittelschmerz, means middle pain, where women will actually know when she's ovulating because she feels this like blister pop on her ovary. So any questions? There's a lot going on here, but it kind of just ties all the way back into the stuff we talked about last class already. So any questions about any of that? Okay. What happens if there is a pregnancy? Or say, what if egg is fertilized?
The progesterone level stays high.
Right. So we obviously don't want to slough off the endometrial lining if there's going to be a pregnancy. So it turns out, remember I was saying that little egg, so you have a zygote is the fertilized egg, becomes what we call like the pre-embryo, which is got like a, if this is the ovaries, here's the fallopian tubes going into the uterus. This is such an ugly drawing. As this little thing is developing and moving down and getting into its position, it starts creating a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin. Human chorionic gonadotropin talks to your corpus luteum and preserves the corpus luteum. So what's going to happen if the corpus luteum never degenerates?
It'll continue creating progesterone.
It'll continue making progesterone, which means what?
The wall won't slough off.
The wall won't slough off. You've missed your period, right? The period does not come because the corpus luteum never degenerates. So does that make sense? In fact, this, when you pee on a stick to see if you're pregnant, those little pregnancy tests, this is what they're looking for. It's a test to look for the presence of HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, in your body, because that is, it's like in Horton Hears a Who. We're here, we're here, we're here, we're here. It's like the little message coming out of the little developing embryos saying that it's there, it's starting, and please don't like flush out the endometrium because I want a place to land. We didn't really, we ran out of time in terms of talking about embryonic and fetal circulation. But basically the placenta is going to develop along with the fetus. It provides a place for the fetal circulation to exchange nutrients and oxygen with the maternal circulation. And the placenta is also an endocrine organ, which is going to be making important hormones. So at about 3 months, the placenta takes over for making the progesterone. So this will last for about 3 months. At the end of the first trimester is where there's a handoff between the corpus luteum and the placenta. So that's a place where people often have miscarriages. If there is like a hiccup in that handoff of the progesterone, you can actually have just the whole wall of the uterus just detach and lose the pregnancy. So yeah, there's lots more. In the interest of time, we're not going to go into. The placenta does lots of cool stuff. Relaxes your joints, so your just your hips are loosier, goosier, and everything. And people's feet get bigger because just the joints spread out and stuff. So everybody get human chorionic gonadotropin. It's going to break the cycle. Normally at the end of this 28 days, corpus luteum degenerates and we just go back to here. But if HCG, the corpus luteum, never degenerates, we keep the gonadotropin releasing hormone suppressed. This stays down. In fact, birth control pills, different ones, a lot of them work actually by keeping the levels of estrogens up, which is going to keep suppressing gonadotropin releasing hormones, so you never have FSH to trigger the development of an egg. There's so many other cool, other things, actually progesterone, like if this is the uterus. In the first part of the cycle, if this is the cervix here. Cervix is kind of the neck, the entrance. This is the os, which is the little entrance. With estrogen, like the mucus becomes kind of thin and stringy. So like if there are sperm, it's easy to get up in here. And there's even like little strings that guide them up. Under progesterone, right? The progesterone is assuming post-ovulation already. The mucus actually becomes like a plug, just clogs it off. So it makes it kind of sealed off. So if there is something developing, it's sealed off in there. We can talk a little bit more about the like the vaginal canal. Part of that vasocongestion that I was talking about is also blood vessels in the walls of the vaginal canal are kind of filling, and a lot of the lubrication, like when a woman's sexually aroused and becomes more lubricated wet, it's not because of there's some gland making something. It's just more about kind of filtration of fluids coming out of the vessels lining the vaginal canal. At the same time, there are little glands that do feed in kind of right near the entrance of the vagina there. They're called greater vestibular glands or Bartholin glands, which would be, the homologs to like the Cowper's glands in the dude. But most of the lubrication is not from glands. The lubrication comes from kind of this vasocongestion and kind of fluid that kind of seeps out as all the blood vessels get engorged. What else do I want to say? We can go share screen. External female genitalia. again, what is the official word for external, the entirety of the external female genitalia?
The vulva.
Yeah, vulva. In some of my old textbooks, they still call it the pudendum, which is Latin for shameful, which is kind of fascinating. But more modern is the vulva, and again, there's like I said, labia majora is actually what would end up being the scrotum in the dude, except in the woman, it's these outer lips. Labia minora. Again, the clitoris. The clitoris is homologous to the glans penis. Its only purpose there is just to feel good. It has those nice sensory nerve endings. It has spongy tissue to engorge during sexual arousal. The urethral opening is its own thing. The vaginal opening, like I was saying, the kind of sexual pleasure, urinating, and copulation are separate things instead of getting all rolled into one like in the dude. You can also see though the urethral opening is right there. So the urethra is much shorter. It's only like 1.5 inches in a woman. And there's close proximity to the anus where there's going to be fecal bacteria and stuff. So you can see it's not that shocking that women are much more susceptible to urinary tract infections. Bacteria don't have as far to go. They only have to go in 1.5 inches, plus there's more bacteria just lying around there in the region. Let's see what else I want to say. The last thing before we just tie this off, let's talk just briefly about overall just kind of human sexual response. So a lot of what how people first figured this out, where there was this married couple that were sex researchers, Masters and Johnson, that looked at like over 10,000 acts of couple sex and masturbation, and they had all sorts of little sensors, in people, and trying to figure out what's going on a physiological basis. And they kind of took it into like 3 or 4 parts. They talked about arousal. And arousal is where things are kind of going from their baseline. And a big part of, we talked about vasocongestion. Actually, the 2 big physiological terms they came up with were vasocongestion and myotonia. Myotonia means you're clenching your muscles, you're kind of tightening up. Things are getting more tense, and lots of things, whether it's the spongy tissue of the penis or just all the tissue on the inside of your thighs, are just getting more engorged with blood. Arousal, things are going into this other zone, like touching. If you touch your genitals, just right now, it's gonna just, okay, it feels like touch. If you've been sexually aroused and there's more vasocongestion and stuff, you touch, it feels really different. The same touch is not going to feel the same in different moments. When everything is kind of good to go, we call that plateau. And then there's that, climax, the orgasm, which in the guy, that's got ejaculation. In the woman, there's just intense pleasure and myotonia and all that. And then there's what they call resolution. Things kind of going back to normal. So these were like the 3 with 4 main things, but then they found differences between men and women. So like in men, it usually looked like arousal, plateau, and plateau doesn't have to last long. It can be everything's good to go and it goes, or it could be it's everything's good to go and you linger, but it just means everything's good to go. Orgasm in a guy, there's what's called a refractory period. after resolution, it takes a while before you can get back into the beginning of this. When people are young, it might be minutes. If people are like in their 70s or 80s, it might be hours or days even. So that the length of the refractory period can be determined by kind of your stage of life. In females, they found way more variation. In guys, it was almost just this. It's like the guy got excited, he came, and there was resolution and refractory period. In women, it was much more common to hit plateau and never orgasm and come back down. That was nice, but didn't go, didn't have an orgasm. You could go and have something that looks substantially similar to the classic male response. But because there's no refractory period, it was also possible for women to have an orgasm, but then have multiple orgasms before resolution because there's no refractory period after the orgasm. So there was much more variation with the woman. But like I was mentioning, both men and women have like that vasocongestion, even though some of it's not quite as obvious to see in the woman. Myotonia, that kind of just clenching your muscles, you're getting more tense. What else? The last thing I'll say, just as a closer, orgasm is something people have looked at and wondered, like, what is it like for a guy or for a woman? Like, they had one study where they had people write their experiences of orgasm, but they had to like pull out any words that would make it clear whether it was from the viewpoint of a man or a woman, and then had like all these grad students kind of read these descriptions of orgasm and decide, is this a guy or a woman describing their orgasm? And it was like at chance. So it seems whatever it is, it's kind of substantially yummy for everybody. So that is that. So any questions about any of that?
Does human chorionic gonadotropin, you said it's made by the Corpus Luteum for the first?
No. It's made, it's made by the little preembryo.
But it keeps the, you're right. So, but it keeps the Corpus Luteum making progesterone for the first 3 months, and then it hands it off
to the placenta.
After those 3 months, doesn't the placenta also keep making HCG, or is it just done and it's fulfilled its role after 3 months?
I think the placenta is just making the progesterone that's necessary. That's my understanding of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. What else? Yeah. I can give you another word just because it'll show up in your atresia. It's kind of a fun, I think it's a pretty word. Although for kind of a, remember I said that under FSH, lots of primordial, more than one primordial follicle start developing to become, the mature thing. So one of them does, but lots of other ones fall by the wayside. Atresia is the word for the kind of degeneration of the developing little follicles that never make it to the end. Right? So you do not want to be the follicle undergoing atresia, because that means like your story's over. You don't get to have your destiny being a new human being or something. So anyway, I think it's a cool word. Otherwise, yeah, there's so much more we could talk, but let's leave it there.